NATO. Soon, Merkel distanced herself, insisting that, from a German perspective, NATO is our security alliance. On the 3rd of January 2020, Trump unilaterally ordered the assassination of the head of Iran's foreign military operations in retaliation for an attack by Iranian-backed Iraqi militias on the American embassy in Baghdad. Putting aside their rows over Britain's imminent departure from the EU, Johnson, Macron and Merkel issued a joint statement saying there was an urgent need for de-escalation. Frenzied political and media commentators asked if the Third World War was about to begin. Economically, nearly everywhere over the winter of 2019 to 20, the prospects for growth were worsening. After 3 years of trying, the American Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, had given up on returning policy to anything approaching monetary normalcy. In September 2019, the overnight money markets where banks borrow from each other froze, as they had first done in August 2007 at the onset of the 2007-8 financial crash. Without quite acknowledging that it was doing so, the Fed turned back to the practice of creating money to buy assets, what is known as quantitative easing, QE. 2 months later, the European Central Bank, ECB, resumed its QE program, while still waiting for a long-delayed decision from the German Constitutional Court on the policy's legality in Germany. Even China, which had done much to drive the world economy for a decade, was experiencing significantly slower growth. In the energy sphere, the world appeared at a turning point. For the first time since 2009, annual world oil production fell. The gap between oil consumed and oil produced reached its highest level since 2007, when prices were hurtling towards a final peak of $150 a barrel. The credit conditions that followed the 2007-8 crash drove a flood of capital into the American shale oil sector. But now, a pressure for action on climate change accelerated. Investors were deserting American and European oil companies. What, a decade earlier, would have been perceived as a medium-term disaster for oil was now seen as promising evidence that the world was on a 3 to 4 decade path away from fossil fuels to green energy. It was into this extensive turmoil that the COVID-19 emergency arrived. While it had its own extraordinary effect, it also acted as a window on the decade of disruption that preceded it. Over the course of 2020, many of the fault lines that had already done so much to shape the 2010s shuddered again. There is no singular explanation of the disruption. Nonetheless, a good number of its causes were interactive in their effects. Take Brexit. It had a particular history in Britain's democratic politics, Britain's absence from the euro, and the EU's unbending constitutional order. But it was also a product of wider changes that on the surface were separate from it. When oil prices surged in 2011, the Fed and the Bank of England did not respond. The ECB, by contrast, raised interest rates twice. While the British economy continued its recovery, the Eurozone plunged back into recession. For the next few years, Britain became an employer of last resort for the Eurozone's southern members, while, under Mario Draghi's leadership, the ECB endeavoured to find a means of running an asset purchase programme that the German Constitutional Court might tolerate. By the time Draghi had persuaded Merkel he had one, David Cameron was at least halfway to concluding he should promise the British electorate the chance to vote on leaving the EU. Then, just as the British Prime Minister was preparing to hold that referendum, the Syrian refugee crisis made Germany's outsized influence within the EU overt to the voters, whom he needed to persuade that Britain should continue with the status quo. Like Brexit, Donald Trump's successful electoral insurgency in 2016 had a particular history, this time in the long-term fractures in the American Republic. But it also occurred in a geopolitical context, connecting the United States' re-emergence as the world's largest oil and gas producer to China's post-2015 industrial strategy, to the return of Russia to the Middle East. In part, Trump triumphed electorally by asserting to American voters that where the United States was strong in its power was not being used, and where it was weak, it was trapped. What became the geopolitical choice in the 2016 election had a structural logic. In a world in which China and Russia were moving